Today we're out here in the wilds of the Midwest of North America, and we're out on the hunt for basing. Hello again, friends. The amount of products on the market today that we can use for basing our miniatures is vast, and it seems to be growing every single month. And I do appreciate many of these products, and I use many of them, but I also really like to stretch my hobby dollar as far as I can. So, with that in mind, we're going to head out into nature, and we're going to try to build 3 unique bases using only what I can find for free in the woods. We'll start with an easy one, bark. You see, bark comes in all different kinds. There's all different trees, and they all have beautiful individual styles of bark. You see here, this is an ash tree. Doesn't look anything like this old oak tree right here. And make sure you have a wide variety of barks for all your needs. This bark has some moss on it. Ain't nothing wrong with a little moss. Oftentimes I think moss looks more like static grass than that fake bollocks that some of those folks use. But really, you have nothing to worry about with it. You see, after some super glue and some primer and some paint, it ain't going nowhere. I'll be cactus long before this moss falls off your base. Take a look at this beautiful dirt. You know, this is the lifeblood of our planet, and it's great for hobbying as well. You know, you can take this stuff, put it right in your oven, and you can have it for great sand and rocks and dirt. It'll be dirt, really. This cheeky bastard's known as buckthorn. She's really an invasive species in the area, and if she has her way, she'll take over this whole forest. You see, what she does is she takes root and spreads like wildfire, and she'll choke out all the other trees, so none of the baby trees will grow. So what do we do with an invasive species like this? Well, we harvest her. And how we harvest her is we harvest her for her roots. You see, buckthorn, it's got real strong roots, and take a look at that. Isn't she a beaut, right? These are all sorts of wonderful uses in the hobby, whether it's using it as roots ourselves or an old gnarled tree or anything like that. Use what she gives you. One of my favorite things for basing is the most common out in the bush. You see, it's leaves. You can dry out these leaves on your counter for about a month or so, and they get nice and dry. And see, from there, you can just crumple them all up into a nice little fine powder, and they can become wonderful ground debris for your basing. It looks like a real forest floor, which is really what we're looking for. So don't forget the leaves. This old Sheila here has seen better days. She's probably been rotting out in the woods here for, I don't know, maybe 5 years. But you see, there's some great things that we can harvest as she returns to the Mother Earth. You see, about this stage, they get nice and brittle, and you can see all the beautiful wood fibers, and you can break them up, and they look just like a real tree stump, real logs. It's beautiful. Found ourselves a nice rock here. See, this is a nice soft rock, a sandstone, and these are going to make great terrain pieces for us. Obviously not in their current state, right? So we need to get out is your favorite hatchet. You take the blunt end, and you just knock off some pieces like that. You get them all ground up just the way you like it. Now, if you don't have a yard to go scavenging in, or you live in a city where you don't have a lot of places to go looking, fear not. There are always public parks or state parks or other public accessible properties that you can go out digging. So with a little Google search, you too can go out and find a spot for free basing materials. Once I start the actual building process for a base, I like to work from big to small. This means I take my largest chunks of rock or cork or bark and I start there. We're always going to be building down with smaller and smaller bits as we go. If we start too small and then add something big on top, it's not going to look natural. We need these big sections to be filled in and to create a smooth transition for a more natural looking environment. The first base I'm going to build is a forest landscape with plenty of exposed earth and debris on the forest floor. This is a great starting point for many basing types, and it works for all sorts of settings, whether fantastical, realistic, or science fiction.
continue to work my way down to smaller and smaller materials. Eventually, we use our dirt to create earth and ground covering, as well as filling in areas around the larger pieces of the model. You can always go through and add a second layer of dirt if you want to build in more height or cover larger gaps where the ground meets the larger bark pieces to create a more realistic look. I typically use 2 different kinds of super glue when I build my bases. I know some folks like to use PVA glue, sometimes thinned down, or sometimes even hot glue. Hot glue tends to be a mess in my experience, although I'm sure folks are much more adept at using it than myself. PVA glue is great because you can cover large areas and do a lot of bases at once. But if you're just going to do a couple bases, I highly recommend super glue thin. This stuff dries so incredibly fast and it adheres and spreads out evenly across the surface, especially for gluing down small bits of leaves and rocks and dirt. It really does the job quick. Be careful though. This stuff is incredibly quick drying. I have glued my fingers together more times than I care to admit, and I've lost some fingerprints in the process. I also use a standard thicker super glue for my larger bits, my big chunks of bark and rock and cork, to get them glued down and adhered and stuck in well. My second and smallest base will be a little bit more unique and odd than the first. This one I envision something from a fantastical world, maybe where magical creatures roam, or even a foreign alien planet. We're going to really bring this to life in a few ways, mostly with our paint choices later on, but for now we're going to make sure we add some of this funky shaped moss that we gathered and add this to look like alien plant life. Our final and largest base got me thinking about somewhere near the water. Not underwater, but really close by where the wetness and the spray of the waves could be felt on our base itself. It could be on a craggy shore of an island. It could be near a rocky riverbed. Regardless, I want that feel, and I had that in mind as I decided to build this base. My final steps are typically those nice little touches that really put our base over the edge. Things like small leaves, small twigs, roots, little gnarled pieces of wood, maybe even a discarded weapon or a skull. All right, let's get down to painting these bases. I start with a black primer, and then I shoot an off-centered white highlight across them fairly strongly. I like to use inks when painting my bases very often for a couple of reasons. First of all, they start off extremely vibrant and rich, and they're also very thin. They can also be thinned down very easily, and that can allow us to keep that zenithal undercoat for natural shadows and highlights. I've found that artist grade inks are often much more strong than the ones you find from miniature hobby brands. When I start painting my bases with inks, I like to work from dark to light. This way I can just look at my zenithal coat. Where is some of that black paint still showing? That's where I start my dark, rich colors. Also, if you start with a light color and then you go with the dark over it, you're going to end up covering up so much of your light colors and you're going to lose them. So I go from dark, work my way up to a mid-tone, and then to my brightest colors like my yellows and my oranges. Another great benefit of using inks is their long working time. Once I get a couple of colors down and placed next to each other, I can clean my brush and go back and kind of blend those colors together for a more natural transition of vibrant colors. This also means that I can add additional colors while the paints are still wet, and I can add more depth of color, whether I wanted to add more interesting nuances to the rocks, or I wanted to increase the vibrancy where the light would be peeking through the canopy and hit the ground below. Once I have all my initial inks established, I want to make sure that I hit them with this high-powered heat gun in order to really get those inks to cure and be fully dried. If inks aren't fully dried and cured, they can pull out. Now, to boost some contrast and some interest on our base, I'm going to turn to a real acrylic paint. I like to use Pro Acryl's Ivory for this. I mix a little bit of that ink that's already on my palette to this opaque paint, and I create a highlight tone for the various areas on the base. Because this paint is opaque, it's going to really allow us to build our highlights quickly while still showing that true bright color in our midtones. If you want to build more vibrancy and color in your highlights, you can always go back through and glaze your inks over the top again, especially in a brighter color. This is true try-hard mode if you really want your bases to pop. Let's finish up our other two bases using the same approach and techniques as we did in the first. Remember when we created our story of what we wanted these bases to look like? We want to use that as inspiration for our color choice. If I want it to feel like a warm, secluded forest environment, how can my colors achieve that? After completing this final base, I think that I'm losing a little bit of my intention of it being truly near a wet area, actually being right on the edge of water. I don't want to go to a full resin pour because I'm lazy and that's a ton of work. But I do have this cool stuff called Woodland Scenics Realistic Water. It requires no mixing. I just take out a little pipette and dip it right where I want to, and it tends to auto level. Now, it will shrink down and won't have this real thick consistency when it dries, but it will be very shiny, and you can go through with multiple layers to build up the height of your water level if you'd like it. I think this really does end up selling the impression that we are right on the shore of some water. If your realistic water has any bubbles on the surface, just use a toothpick to pop them quickly, and then use these tiny 2-scale glass beads that I use for bubbles to sell the effect even more. I hope this video inspired you to implement some free hobby basing techniques into your rotation and maybe get you outside for some vitamin D. And if nothing else, to look at the world around you and see all the hobby potential that it has. If you liked what you saw today, you know what to do. Remember, be kind to one another, and we'll see you next time.
Look at these beauties, beautiful mushrooms just growing right here for us. Now, I'm not going to actually use these in basing. You see, mushrooms are far too spongious. Oh, look at this. Look at this. Let's get a close-up of this one. Okay, let's see if we can get a good close-up here. Look what we found there. This is a little bit of bark with some moss on it. And look at those little things growing on it. Doesn't that look just like a real plant, full scale? Take a look at this bark. This bark is a beautiful bark. We'll do some dual wielding. Hey neighbor.